Our next speaker is Lasha Kharazi, who is an associate professor at the Georgian American University in Tbilisi, while he also lectures and courses in modern philosophy at the Caucasus University and European University, and he is a fellow of the Knap Foundation. His primary research interest is the problems of ontology, the question of being and non-being understood in their philosophical historical unfolding. Lasha has published several articles on the philosophies of Heidegger, Deleuze, and Spinoza, including The Sense of Political in Spinoza's Ethics in 2016, and Deleuze and the Politics of Thinking in 2020. His paper today is titled The Untrembling Heart of Aletheia, Heidegger's Path to the Other Inception. Lasha.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So without further ado, I will start reading my presentation. There is a time to think and a time to think on what has been thought. This symposium speaks of the later. Its temporality is that of looking back. Such a look is only for the sake of what lies ahead. To look back, not with the intention to summarize, to overview, to evaluate, or to taxonomize what has been done, but to say something that has been left unsaid before. That in some sense is always of not being able to say anything that was not said before. Looking back with Heidegger is always of the saying. In our case, the phenomenality of this look is obviously composed of the Heidegger and Classical Thought seminars. The seminars where philosophy is taught from within its own necessity, in the needlessness of any support, if we say it with Heidegger's words. I owe my deepest sense of placidness in thought to these seminars. Therefore, as for the beginning, let me express my heartfelt gratitude to Lawrence Hemming and Aaron Turner, to the founders of the seminars. My thankfulness to all the participants of it. No genuine movement in thinking can emerge without those whose presence holds in togetherness the responsibility to speak and to listen. Whenever the thought of Heidegger is the thing that is looked back, above all, according to his own philosophy, such a look must always be of thinking with him and never about him. Saying this by no means is translatable into whatever kind of psychologizable sentiment, but is of a sole and simple idea that Heidegger's philosophy suffices. The source of such sufficiency is each of those ones for whom the question of being is the foremost question of philosophy, for whom the saying of the being is the being of the saying. In the midst of this sufficiency, Heidegger's philosophy is itself experienced as a permanent attempt to search for, to create the saying of being in the openness of continuation. Partaking in this creative search from within its innermost undelatedness, that is to say, to think being in its historical unfolding, shows the essence of this sufficiency. The being historical thinking, das geschichtliche Denken, is the essence of Heidegger's yet-to-be-approached sufficiency. What follows is an attempt to concretize the essence of thinking being historically. For an initial intimation of what lies in the depths of this essence, let us read the following thought of Heidegger. The being historical thinking is the venture of saying the unsayable without naming it, from GA 71. For the reason of the centrality of the quoted passage for this paper, let me read the German original of it. Das sehensgeschichtliche Denken ist die Wagnis der Sage des Unsagbaren, ohne es zu nennen. The being historical thinking as an essence of the sufficiency of Heidegger's philosophy is measured by one's preparedness to step inside the space of such venturing. This space is of the words, of those words that hold in themselves the saying of the being, das Sagenhaft des Wortes, Heidegger often repeats in being historical treatises. Stepping inside this space is of welcoming and of a knowing of those words that are already there, the ones already gathered by Heidegger. Here the hesitation to use these words without roundabouts, without rearrangements or modifications fades away. The fear of not imitating is dismantled in favor of something that is yet to be thought. The simple saying of absencing presence is where Heidegger's being historical thinking places itself. But such a saying, every time whenever it is uttered, is of the presencing absence. However, as we have seen in the quoted passage above, this way of thinking is unusual. Not only does it venture to say the unsayable, but it does so without naming it. In what way is this unsayable, the saying but not naming of which defines, in what way is this unsayable, the saying but not naming of which defines the being historical thinking? Evidently, whenever something is said without being named, The sign is what we have at our disposal. The ensemble is of being, and now perhaps even more so of beinglessness, of Signlosigkeit, because being itself is in the way of the signs. But for Heidegger of the being historical thinking, for whom the groundworks are in constant movement toward, away from, and alongside each other, the ensemble is not so much of one of the groundworks, but of the very distance in between them. And obviously, of all distances, the one between das Sein and das Sein is the most being historical. Everything in being historical thinking revolves around the inexplicability, inapparency, and yet of unavoidability of this distance. The truth of this distance parallels with the truth of the distance between the first and other inceptions. Where is das Sein for Heidegger? Where is the other inception? Not so much what, but where is the question with regard to being historical thinking, the topology, and on certain occasions even the topology of time. For clarifying the relationality between the two inceptions, the following is to be recited from Beiträge. The quote: "The original knowing of the first inception and idest of its history means gaining a foothold in the other inception. This is fulfilled in the transition from the guiding question, what is presencing in present, the question of beingness, being, to the grounding question, what is the truth of being. Being and being with why are the same and yet fundamentally different." End of quote. Two moments are of decisive importance to us here. First, the fundamental jointuring between the two inceptions, the Fußfassen in the other inception every time again being prepared by the original annulment of the first one. This means that the first inception already contains the horizon of the second inception as a space of othering from its historical misappropriation. And the second point, namely that Sein and Sein are the same and yet fundamentally different from each other. This interplay, Zuspiel of sameness and difference between Sein and Sein, clearly echoes with the interplay between the first and other inceptions. But why does Heidegger speak of inception at all? Usage of this word Nietzschean, that is to say genealogical in its content, in its philosophical motivity? Obviously not. He is recurring, so to speak, active technologization of inception, e.g. inception as something that instead of residing back in the past ever again appears and reappears from the coming times, something that even comes the latest in the essential history. See the passages from the opening paragraph of GA 54 is the most immediate proof of this. Is Heidegger's inception a kind of everlasting residue of self-producing force that temporalizes being and thus makes essential history possible? Only partly and maybe even only very remotely it is so, since Heidegger's intimations of inception are never localizable in the immobility of any determination. The question to be asked here should not be of a definition seeking by its character, but of partaking into the question for the sake of what Heidegger of being historical thinking philosophizes the inception. In the fragment 122 of GA 70, he speaks of the recollective thinking ahead into the inception, das erinnernde Vordenken in den Anfang. For such thinking, the inception is the essential unfolding of truth as aletheia, and this truth, as Heidegger says, is being itself. The recollective thinking ahead into the inception is Heidegger's other name for the being historical thinking. Where does this recollective thinking emerge from, and where does it direct itself? The following quote is from the same GA 70. Being historical thinking is recollection into the first inception as thinking ahead into the other. The belonging together of the two inceptions is said here. The being historical thinking, not only in its dispositionality, very improper word, but still to classical tradition, but also by the task that it carries from within Heidegger's philosophical sufficiency. Each time is measured by its singularized annulment to hold the two inceptions together. At this point, we reveal why no naming of the ensemble is required for historical thinking whenever it ventures to say it. The holding in togetherness of two inceptions as an essence of historical thinking sets for itself something more decisive than naming of the ensemble is. This deeply presumed non-necessity, even certain kind of excessiveness of naming, stems from Heidegger's sense for the historically arrived timeliness of not saying too much of something that is to be kept into the silence. Looking for the topos of the man, topos der Mensch, he speaks in GA 71, in the creative responsiveness to the quietening silence of being. The ground of this silence is for the sake of withstanding the abandonment by being. Such withstanding is of the perseverance for Heidegger, being historical thinking, and so each and everyone who thinks being historically perseveres in holding in togetherness the two inceptions. The question we need to address now is how this holding itself is possible. By the passage already quoted above, we know that for being historical thinking, recollection into the first inception is by thinking ahead into the other. Not only there is no other inception without the first one, but the first inception, already in its incipience, is only by the othering of its own being. For Heidegger, there is a concrete place in the history of philosophy where the possibility of holding of these two inceptions was inceptually intimated. Not by sudden circumstances by far. He insists on calling Anaximandros, Parmenides, and Heraclitus inceptual thinkers instead of pre-Socratics, as popularized and established by the Delphian tradition. Inceptual thinkers are the ones with whom we glimpse into the how of holding in togetherness the two inceptions, not only because they dwell inceptually in the inception, but more than this because their word is of the simple saying of being. This is the end of section 1 in GA 55. One remark here as a clarifying premise for everything that follows. Every time we attempt to think of the inceptual thinkers within the space of sufficiency of Heidegger's philosophy, one thing is to be considered. As with the elements of the fourfold, whenever one of them being said are the three already thought with it, the same with inceptual thinkers. Saying any one of them already implies thinking of the other two, and this is true without exception. Let us reiterate that the reason for addressing the inceptual thinkers is to find a way of how to hold in togetherness the two inceptions. In Zeringen of 1973, on the last seminar session held on September 8, that in fact was Heidegger's last act of philosophizing in public, he showed the way how and where such holding is to be experienced. The exact coordinate of this experience is Parmenides' poem, Periphuseus, the poem where the need of experiencing all, Χρεώδησε πάντα πιο τεστάλ, has been inceptually vocalized. This all, panta, which for the Elean is composed of the opinions of mortals, proton doxas, and the untrembling heart of the well-rounded Aletheia, Aletheia se Gukleus atremesetor. The boundaries of pantaputestai are not to be conceived in their unachievable, never fathomable abstractness, hovering somewhere in the unsurmountable heights of the world, where no measure is anymore. Instead, pantaputestai is of each of those ones who persevere in thinking, including Heidegger himself, who never left the never-exhaustible middle of pantaputestai. To make a step farther here, from the Zeringen seminar, that part is to be addressed where Heidegger proposed to read his short text written during 1972-73 under the title Aletheia se Gukleus atremesetor. Delving deep into it opens the place where the possibility of holding together of two inceptions is not only apprehended, but summoned for being recollected within the thought that looks ahead into the future. Parmenides' single word, to eon, is the thematic center of this seminar. It is to eon, according to Heidegger, that is addressed by Parmenides in his elliptical saying, estigareinai, the saying which, as Heidegger testifies, he has been considering a long time, being even ensnared into it. The saying which says that being is, or as Heidegger translates it, presencing, namely presences, anwest, namely anwesen. Eon, again referring to Heidegger, is neither of das Seiende nor of das Sein, but of eon itself, in its untranslatable sufficiency, in its untrembling affinity with estigareinai, with the presencing presence. The untrembling heart of Aletheia is the essence of eon, of presencing presence. As the presencing itself, anwesen selbst, eon is in the everlasting greeting of Aletheia, and for this reason the untrembling heart is of both, of eon and of Aletheia. Noteworthily, in Periphuseus, the word atremes, untrembling, adheres to both eon and Aletheia. In Zeringen, Heidegger one last time retrospectively looks back into the inception for the sake of thinking of what lies ahead, thus being in a creative responsiveness to his own saying. The quote from the last sentence of his foundational lecture, Der Satz der Identität of 1957. Only when we turn thoughtfully toward what has already been thought, will we be turned to use for what must still be thought. In his final retrospective look, Rückblick at Parmenides, Heidegger sees the aeon as the presencing presence, in the concealedness of which the untrembling heart of Aletheia is essencing. It is in such seeing that for Heidegger's own pantaputestai is consummated. At the end of the seminar, he asks a question that by form is clearly a rearrangement of a Hamletian question. To glimpse purely presencing itself presencing, or not to glimpse, that is here in the inception of Western thinking the question. Essentially, this question was also of Heidegger's own most. Perhaps even this very question since the times of Parmenides has been the most fundamental question of philosophy. After all, is not Seinsfrage die Frage nach der Anwesenheit? The philosophical path of Heidegger's Dithesis commenced with his enthusiasm to explicate the so-called ontological difference as much, as frequently, as thoroughly as possible. However, already from the big historical treatises, the primacy of the later gradually gave the way to the interplay of the mystery of Aletheia, to the parallelism between Seinsvergessenheit and Geheimnisesvergessenheit, the concealment of the presencing in whole, the Verborgenheit, the Sein, the im Ganzen, the most inceptual of all the concealments, belongs to the essence of Aletheia. No one concealment would ever be possible without inceptual concealedness of the inceptual presencing. Together with the philosophy of Aletheia, that is with being historical thinking, das Sein dem Ganzen, its inceptual concealedness is fathomed as the original place where Aletheia's love for Kryptein belongs. Now it is clear why Heidegger speaks of the being historical thinking as a recollective thinking ahead into the inception. What is recalled in this thinking is the inceptual concealedness of the whole of what is presencing, and something that is to be thought ahead is the inapparent, the simple perseverance into the midst of this presencing. Earlier we asked about the possibility of holding the two inceptions together. Being historical thinking is itself this possibility. Aeon, the presencing presence, is the ground word of this thinking, the word that lets this holding to presence in the unconcealedness. The untrembling heart of Aletheia beats in the depths of this word, the heart that knows how not to be bored with what is presencing in presence, how to persevere in what is hosestin, notwithstanding the receding of the later. With being historical thinking, the philosophy of the heart commences. This philosophy has nothing to do with the sentimentalities of the heart, with the sorrows of young Werther, the boundless search for meaning of Konstantin Levin, or the unleashedness of Captain Ahab. This heart is often in appearances of Aletheia, of its ways of unconcealing the concealed, but it's the way more complex structure, of course, unconcealing, following Lawrence, the concealedness of the concealed, or unconcealing the concealedness itself, the essence of the concealedness. In the age of the planetarism of Gestell, we witness how the essence of man is weighed. The scales of this weighing is historically and even factically unprecedented. Never before the necessity of being in responsiveness to the question of the mystery, and if you will, the destiny of man was so immediate. Heidegger's last words spoke of the hearkening to the untrembling heart of Aletheia. What lies inside this heart is at the same time the ways towards it, so that we can never listen to it unless we are already on the path towards it. This path is of the holding together the two inceptions in the presencing presence of Aeon. As for the beginning, such a holding belongs to the possibility of the simple greeting of the fragment 54 of Heraclitus, which says, Harmonia phanes phaneres greison, the inapparent harmony swaying over all and everything that appears. Thank you very much.